Millions dead, cities reduced to ash, and a world left fractured. World War II remains the deadliest conflict in human history. Yet the man who devastated a continent started as a lonely, unremarkable boy from a small Austrian town who wanted to paint watercolors. Born in Braunau am Inn in 1889, young Adolf Hitler had a childhood defined by friction. His father, a strict customs official, aggressively demanded his son follow in his footsteps and become a government worker. Adolf, dreaming of art and architecture, rebelled against these demands. This personal defiance quickly turned political. He grew to despise the multicultural Austro-Hungarian Empire he lived in. Instead, he obsessed over an idealized vision of German nationalism, believing German-speaking people were inherently superior to the other ethnic groups in the empire. Long before he engaged in formal politics, his worldview was shaped by this baseline of defiance. He was already building a psychological need to attach himself to a powerful, exclusive group identity to compensate for his own isolation. In 1903, his father died. For Hitler, it was a release. He dropped out of school without graduating, and by age 18 he moved to Vienna, convinced this was where his artistic career would finally begin. Reality hit him almost immediately. He applied to the prestigious Vienna Academy of Fine Arts and failed the entrance exam twice. The examiners noted his skills were weak, specifically pointing out his inability to draw human figures. Right after this academic rejection, his mother died from breast cancer. In a very short window, he lost both his family and the future he had built his entire identity around. He was now adrift in a major city, without a community, without a profession, or a sense of direction. With his grand ambitions gone, he descended into severe poverty. The teenager who thought he would conquer Vienna's art world ended up sleeping in homeless shelters, surviving by painting and selling cheap postcards to tourists on streets just like this one. But Vienna offered something else to the destitute, a thriving political underbelly. Opportunistic politicians and cheap newspapers ran aggressive campaigns, blaming immigrants and ethnic minorities for the city's economic struggles. This diagram illustrates the psychological mechanism of scapegoating. When someone experiences total personal failure, accepting blame is painful. Instead, they protect their ego by redirecting all that internal failure outward, targeting an isolated group and blaming them for their situation. Hitler internalized this toxic environment. He latched onto the city's rampant anti-Semitism, specifically aimed at Vienna's Jewish population. Instead of accepting that his art was insufficient, he adopted the conspiracy theories of the radical press, blaming unseen elites and Jewish people for his rejection and his invisibility. His aimless childhood resentment now had a specific, politically charged target. His self-pity was hardening into a rigid extremist ideology. By 1913, he left Austria for Munich to be in the country he had idealized, Germany. Just a year later, Europe fractured. World War I erupted, and Hitler immediately volunteered for the German military. He served as a trench messenger on the Western Front. He spent years running orders through a desolate landscape of mud, constant artillery fire, and poison gas, one of the most dangerous roles in the war. While the brutal conditions traumatized millions of young men, Hitler thrived. The military provided exactly what civilian life had denied him: structure, a tight-knit community, and absolute purpose. He proved to be brave and loyal to his commanding officers. For his actions under fire, he was awarded the Iron Cross, tangible proof that he was finally valued by the German Empire. The military machinery had successfully occupied his psychological void. He was no longer a failed, homeless artist, but a decorated soldier fighting for the nation he worshipped. In 1918, the German war effort collapsed. Exhausted by shortages and massive casualties, the German Empire suddenly surrendered. For Hitler, accepting this military defeat meant acknowledging the collapse of the only successful identity he had ever managed to build. To protect his ego, he rejected reality entirely. He latched onto a rumor known as the stab-in-the-back myth. This tactical map illustrates the lie that the German army was undefeated on the front lines, but treacherous politicians and internal enemies had sabotaged the army from within. This delusion perfectly aligned with the hatred he had learned in Vienna. He fused his anti-Semitism with his military zeal, cementing a hyper-paranoid political ideology that blamed Jewish people and left-wing politicians for Germany's downfall. He brought this ideology back to a nation in ruin. The post-war economy was destroyed, the new government was weak, and desperate citizens formed armed factions fighting over the streets. This sequence of personal rejection, social isolation, and catastrophic warfare forged a weaponized extremist, now perfectly positioned to exploit a broken nation. In 1918, the mighty German Empire collapsed. World War I ended in defeat, and Kaiser Wilhelm II fled the country, leaving a nation in shock. A new democratic government, the Weimar Republic, took his place, but citizens almost immediately hated it. The reason was the Treaty of Versailles. The leaders of this new republic were forced to sign it, accepting terms dictated by foreign powers. Germany lost large sections of its territory, its military was severely restricted, and it was ordered to pay massive financial reparations. This financial burden triggered economic disaster. Hyperinflation destroyed the currency. Money lost all value overnight. Families saw their entire life savings wiped out, and soon people were pushing wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. When a country faces starvation and shattered national pride, people don't view a new democratic system as freedom. They view it as weakness. And that power vacuum creates the perfect environment for extreme political movements. After the war, the city of Munich became a chaotic breeding ground for extreme political groups. Street violence was common, and the German military actively monitored these fringe organizations to prevent further instability. One of the men assigned to infiltrate a tiny, insignificant group called the German Workers' Party was a failed artist and former soldier, Adolf Hitler. In these small meetings, Hitler found he could hold an audience's attention for hours. The party leadership watched as his aggressive style began drawing larger and more emotional crowds, proving he possessed a rare talent for persuasion. He quickly took control, transforming this fringe group into the Nazi Party. He observed how audiences reacted when he provided emotional scapegoats for their suffering, specifically targeting communists, the political elites, and Jewish people. Seeing how easily he could move a room to rage, Hitler began treating public anger as a strategic political resource. He stopped trying to solve the nation's problems and started harvesting the desperation behind them. He began organizing mass rallies deliberately designed as theatrical events. Strict military discipline, striking colors, and bold symbols like the swastika were used to project an illusion of absolute power. Hitler practiced the exact mechanics of his delivery. He would start his speeches with a slow, hesitant cadence, before gradually escalating his voice into an infectious rage. Audiences absorbed that emotion. But speeches alone do not seize a country. Hitler created the SA, the stormtroopers or brown shirts, to act as a paramilitary strike force. The SA deliberately instigated violent street battles, brawling openly with communists. The goal was to engineer chaos, making the Weimar democracy appear helpless to maintain law and order. The Nazis intentionally amplified the nation's instability. By making the streets dangerous, Hitler could position his extreme authority as the only viable cure. By 1923, the government looked broken. The peak of hyperinflation and civil unrest convinced Hitler the Weimar Republic was fragile enough to be toppled by force. He had watched Benito Mussolini successfully execute the March on Rome in Italy to seize power, and Hitler decided to mimic this violent strategy in Germany. On November 8th, Hitler and his armed supporters stormed into a Munich beer hall where Bavarian leaders were meeting. Firing a shot into the ceiling, he declared a national revolution had begun. The next morning, he led thousands of supporters on a march through the city, but the state police confronted them. Gunfire erupted. Several Nazis were killed, and the coup collapsed. Hitler fled the scene but was soon arrested. With his followers dead and his violent overthrow crushed, his political career appeared to be finished. Instead of fading into obscurity, Hitler turned his trial for high treason into a national spectacle. He largely abandoned a traditional legal defense. Instead, he subverted the proceedings, using the courtroom itself as a stage to aggressively attack the democratic government that was trying him. Newspapers across the country printed every word of his intense daily speeches. Suddenly, his extreme nationalist ideas were being broadcast to millions of Germans who had never even heard his name before the failed coup. The Weimar justice system tried to punish him, but it inadvertently acted as a megaphone. It transformed a failed local insurgent into a famous national martyr. He was sentenced to prison, but his confinement was surprisingly comfortable. During this time, he dictated his ideological and racial manifesto, Mein Kampf, detailing his plans for Germany. More importantly, his cell gave him time to think. He realized that attempting to break a state from the outside through a violent revolution forces the government to unify against you. To gain absolute power, he needed a new methodology. He would abandon the tactic of a violent coup. Instead, he would use the rules of democracy itself to get elected. The political establishment vastly underestimated his patience. They thought the street brawler was neutralized, failing to recognize his new legal approach. The trial and imprisonment taught Hitler his most dangerous lesson. The most effective way to destroy a democratic republic is to weaponize its own systems from the inside. Democracies rarely collapse because a foreign army drives tanks through the capital. Usually, they are systematically dismantled from the inside out, a legal collapse carried out using the very rules designed to protect them. To understand how that happens, we have to look at Germany and the early 1930s. The global economy had completely shattered after the 1929 stock market crash in the United States. And because the German economy was entirely propped up by American loans, when Wall Street fell, those funds evaporated overnight. The resulting paralysis was absolute. Factories went dark, banks locked their doors, citizens faced widespread starvation. At one point, protest signs highlighted over 2 million unemployed workers, a number that would only climb as the decade dragged on. Meanwhile, the democratic government of the Weimar Republic was entirely paralyzed. Lawmakers spent their time consumed by bitter infighting and endless partisan gridlock, completely incapable of passing any meaningful relief for a starving populace. This is the environment where a republic is most vulnerable. A severe economic vacuum creates genuine desperation, and when people are desperate enough, they become highly willing to abandon their democratic norms, so long as someone promises them immediate salvation. Enter Adolf Hitler. He and the Nazi Party understood exactly how to weaponize this economic misery. Instead of offering complex policy solutions, they launched a massive propaganda campaign promising a radical national rebirth. The strategy was effective. Millions of struggling citizens latched onto the promise of restored pride and economic order. By 1932, explosive electoral victories made the Nazis the largest single political party in Germany. Despite this popularity, Hitler didn't have total control. That required the blessing of Germany's conservative establishment, led by President Paul von Hindenburg. These elite politicians deeply distrusted Hitler, but they made a calculated bet. They believed they could harness his massive crowds while keeping him on a tight leash. That bet led to January 30th, 1933. Believing they had him contained, Hindenburg officially appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The institutional elite voluntarily handed the highest levers of government to an extremist, entirely convinced their established system could control him. Barely 4 weeks into his new role, Hitler found a catalyst. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag, the physical home of the German parliament, burst into flames. Before the embers even cooled, Hitler blamed a vast communist conspiracy. He saturated the country with the claim that a violent revolution was already underway, successfully engineering a nationwide panic that the state itself was under imminent attack. Under the cover of this manufactured hysteria, Hitler drafted the Reichstag fire decree. Using the immediate threat of violence, he pressured President Hindenburg into signing it into law. The legal effects were immediate. The decree entirely suspended major civil liberties. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to assemble were all legally erased overnight. The state police forces were instantly granted unchecked authority. Unburdened by warrants or courts, they swept through the cities, legally arresting thousands of political opponents, journalists, and activists without trial. A state of perpetual, terrifying emergency is a remarkably efficient catalyst for convincing a frightened public to voluntarily surrender their own freedoms. In March 1933, the regime pushed for the final legal kill shot, the Enabling Act. This law was designed to grant Hitler the explicit authority to draft and pass legislation entirely on his own, completely bypassing parliamentary approval. Passing it required a vote from the very lawmakers it would strip of power. The Nazis ensured compliance through raw, physical intimidation. Armed paramilitary guards flooded the parliament building, making it clear to the remaining politicians that a no vote would invite immediate violence. The act passed, and the dominoes fell rapidly. Armed with unchecked legislative power, Hitler systematically banned every rival political party, destroyed the trade unions, and shuttered all independent newspapers. This was the threshold. It was the exact moment the legislative branch voted under extreme duress to make itself completely obsolete. In a single vote, the Republic legally dissolved itself. With the legal framework secured, the Nazis needed to lock down the culture. Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels spearheaded a campaign to completely monopolize all public information. This required physically eradicating dissenting ideas. Across the country, university students and state officials gathered to publicly hurl thousands of books deemed un-German into massive bonfires. But Goebbels didn't just destroy information, he replaced it. Radio broadcasts and heavily produced cinema were deliberately weaponized, piping state-approved ideology directly into the living rooms of the German public. Yet Hitler still faced one internal threat, his own paramilitary force, the SA. They had grown enormous, heavily armed, and their leaders were demanding more influence, alarming the traditional German military. Hitler's solution was absolute. In June 1934, during an event known as the Night of the Long Knives, he launched a violent, targeted purge. SA leadership was arrested and executed without trial, alongside dozens of his remaining political rivals, firmly securing the absolute loyalty of the traditional military elite. When overwhelming psychological propaganda meets sudden surgical violence, the state eliminates both the physical capability to resist and the psychological will to even try. Look at this structural chart of the German executive branch. The final step in the legal takeover required removing the very last institutional barrier. When President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler merged the two highest offices of the land into one. He claimed a new absolute title, Führer. The transition into a totalitarian dictatorship was completely and officially finalized. In barely 18 months, an advanced modern democracy had been completely stripped down, hollowed out, and rebuilt into a total dictatorship. Tragic reality followed. Exhausted by crisis, millions of citizens trade away their civil liberties in exchange for absolute conformity and the illusion of national stability. Democracies don't die because an outside force breaks them. They die when their own legal mechanisms are turned against them, quietly legislating themselves out of existence and setting the stage for global catastrophe. By the late 1930s, the German state answered to one man. Adolf Hitler had dismantled the Republic and secured absolute dictatorial control over the country. Millions of citizens worshipped him with a cult-like devotion, and under his command, the nation's industry rapidly pivoted to build a massive, heavily armed military. With all political opposition crushed, the regime implemented its extreme racial ideology. The Nuremberg laws systematically stripped Jewish citizens of their basic civil rights, excluding them from public life and the protection of the state. That legal persecution soon escalated into open violence. During Kristallnacht, Nazi mobs systematically shattered storefronts, burned synagogues, and attacked Jewish homes across the country. The terror inside Germany was a strict prerequisite for what was to come. Hitler's ideology required endless territorial expansion, and that meant the violence deployed against his own citizens would inevitably be pushed outward onto the rest of Europe. The push for new territory began with the immediate neighbors. In a bloodless annexation known as the Anschluss, German forces simply marched across the border and absorbed Austria into the Reich. The leaders of Britain and France watched this expansion with dread. Still traumatized by the massive casualties of the First World War, they desperately hoped political compromise could satisfy Germany and prevent another continental conflict. They tested this hope at the Munich Agreement. European leaders conceded chunks of Czechoslovakian territory to Hitler in exchange for a promise of peace. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home declaring he had secured peace for our time. That promise evaporated almost immediately. Hitler sent his armies to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving he viewed treaties as temporary conveniences. The appeasement strategy collapsed. Allied nations realized too late that an authoritarian regime built on racial supremacy and endless conquest cannot be negotiated with. On September 1, 1939, German forces crossed into Poland. Left with no other options, Britain and France declared war. This animation breaks down the logic of Germany's new tactical approach, known as blitzkrieg or lightning war. Instead of grinding infantry battles, fast-moving mechanized armor punches through a single point in the enemy line, bypassing static defenses entirely. The speed of this tactic overwhelmed traditional military defenses. Poland fell, followed in rapid succession by Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands. By 1940, the unthinkable happened. Paris was occupied, sending a profound psychological shock across the globe. But across the English Channel, Britain refused to surrender. Under Winston Churchill, the nation absorbed devastating daily air attacks from the Luftwaffe. Despite the heavy bombing, the German Air Force failed to achieve air superiority over the island. This marked the very first structural limit to Hitler's military speed, proving the German war machine could be halted. Yet Hitler was entirely convinced of his own invincibility. Driven by ideological obsession, he broke his non-aggression pact and ordered an invasion of the Soviet Union. This map illustrates the sheer scale of Operation Barbarossa. At first, German forces captured massive swaths of territory, encircling and capturing millions of Soviet soldiers as they pushed deep toward Moscow. But the invasion was built on two fatal miscalculations. First, they underestimated the practically limitless physical geography of Russia. Second, they failed to prepare for the brutal freezing winter, which shattered their overextended supply lines and trapped troops in the snow. Simultaneously, the conflict escalated into a truly global crisis. Japan attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, immediately pulling the United States into the war. Hitler's unchecked ambition had created a strategic trap. Germany was now bleeding out in a multi-front war against the combined industrial and military might of the Soviet Union, Britain, and America. The final turning point came at the Battle of Stalingrad. The German military was broken in brutal urban combat, forcing an agonizing retreat toward Berlin. The squeeze accelerated when Allied forces launched the massive D-Day invasion on the beaches of Normandy, crushing the Nazi Empire from east and west. The architect of all this destruction spent his final days isolated in an underground bunker, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, while the city of Berlin burned to the ground above him. The physical collapse of the Third Reich allowed the world to fully comprehend its crimes. Tens of millions of people lay dead, and the systematic industrial slaughter of the Holocaust was laid bare. The history of this regime is a permanent, living record. It documents precisely how fear can be weaponized to manipulate society, how rapidly democratic institutions collapse without defense, and the devastating global cost of ignoring extreme authoritarianism.